I never thought I'd be asked to walk her down the aisle. Not after everything that happened. Not after the day my father chose her over my own mother. The invitation came on a cold morning, the kind that feels heavy before the snow. The envelope was white, simple, and unassuming, but my name written on it felt like a wound reopening. I held it in my hands for a long time before I dared to open it. Inside, the words were soft, polite, almost innocent. We'd be honored if you could walk Natalie down the aisle. It would mean the world to her. I read that line over and over, my chest tightening with something I couldn't name. Anger, regret, maybe both. I hadn't heard from my father, Mr. David, in years. Not since the day he decided that my fiancée, the woman I loved, was better suited for him than for his own son. It sounds absurd when I say it out loud, doesn't it? But life has a strange way of testing how much your heart can endure. I still remember the way Natalie used to smile, the way her eyes softened when she looked at me, like I was the only person in the world who truly saw her. She didn't have much. She lived in a small flat near the river, worked 2 jobs, and still found time to bring me coffee on late nights when I was struggling with my degree. She was pure. And maybe that purity was what my father wanted to own. He had everything: wealth, power. My mother, Victoria, was the quiet kind of woman who stayed, even when love had long stopped visiting our home. She used to say, "Silence isn't weakness, Anthony. Sometimes it's just dignity, wearing a softer face." I didn't understand her words then. I do now. Because when my father took Natalie away, not by force, but by persuasion, luxury, and promises, I didn't fight. I couldn't. I was too broken to even raise my voice. And now, years later, he wanted me to walk her down the aisle, like some cruel joke dressed as an honor. I looked out the window that morning, the frost painting slow patterns on the glass, and I thought to myself, maybe this is life's way of inviting me back into the story I tried so hard to forget. But this time, I wasn't the same Anthony who had lost everything. This time, silence would speak for me. People often say that childhood shapes who we become. If that's true, then I was shaped by silence. Our house in Stockholm was enormous, the kind with tall glass walls, white marble floors, and a constant chill that no fireplace could ever warm. My father, Mr. David, ran his company like a kingdom, and at home he ruled the same way. Every sound felt like it needed his permission, even laughter. My mother, Victoria, used to move quietly through the house, her soft footsteps blending into the echo of the walls. She always looked calm, like a lake that hides what's happening underneath. She'd smile when she saw me, her eyes tired but full of love. She never raised her voice, even when she had every reason to. Father and I were never close. To him, I was a reminder of imperfection. Too soft, too hesitant, too much like my mother. He wanted a son who would carry his name with power, not empathy. He wanted a mirror of himself, and I was nothing like him. When I was 16, I decided I'd never be a businessman. I wanted to write, to paint, to make something honest out of the chaos inside me. My father laughed. He said art was for people who didn't have ambition. I remember his words like a scar. Dreams don't feed you, Anthony. Money does. My mother didn't say anything. She just touched my shoulder gently. A quiet way of saying, do what makes you alive. Years later, when I left for university, I carried that silence with me. I rented a small apartment near the old town, overlooking the frozen river. That's where I met Natalie. She worked at a tiny cafe near the campus, the kind of place that smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon. She wasn't like anyone I'd met before. Her laughter was free, unpolished. She had this way of talking with her hands, always moving, always alive. The first time we spoke, I was sitting by the window, sketching strangers who passed by. She came over with a cup of coffee and said, "You draw people, but you never draw yourself." "Why?" Her voice was soft, curious. I looked up and smiled awkwardly. Maybe I don't want to know what I look like on paper. She laughed, that kind of real laugh that makes time slow down. "Then maybe one day, I'll draw you," she said. And she did. That's how it began, in the middle of an ordinary winter afternoon. Two souls quietly finding warmth in each other. Natalie lived in a small flat with peeling paint and a window that didn't close properly. She had nothing, yet she carried herself like she had everything. She told me once that happiness didn't need wealth, just peace. I didn't believe her then, but I wanted to. We spent long evenings walking by the river, sharing dreams. She wanted to open her own cafe one day. I wanted to write a book about love that survives pride. It felt like we were building a tiny world that nobody else could touch. When I introduced her to my mother, Victoria smiled with tears in her eyes. "She's kind," she whispered. "Protect that?" But when my father met her, everything changed. He didn't even try to hide his disapproval. He looked her up and down, as if she were a number that didn't add up. "You're a barista?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she answered politely. "And you plan to marry my son?" "I plan to love him," she said quietly. I remember the silence after that. My father's face turned cold. My mother lowered her gaze, and I foolishly thought love could bridge that gap. But love is fragile when pride enters the room. Over time, Father started inviting Natalie to family events, pretending to accept her. He'd ask her about her life, her dreams, the things I thought he never cared about. I saw how his eyes softened when she spoke, how his tone changed when she laughed. At first, I ignored it. I thought maybe, finally, he was learning to see people for who they were, not what they had. I was wrong, because behind those kind smiles, my father was building something, a plan, a manipulation. I wouldn't understand until it was too late. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother look worried. She didn't say much, but I caught her watching Natalie and Father with quiet fear. One night she came into my room and said softly, "Be careful, Anthony. Sometimes admiration is just a shadow of desire." I didn't want to believe her. I loved Natalie. I trusted her, and I thought my father, after all these years, was finally trying to do the right thing. But I should have known men like him don't change. They just learn new ways to control. I didn't know it then, but my life was about to take a turn so cruel it would silence even my mother's gentle heart. The shift began so quietly that I almost didn't notice it. Love doesn't disappear in a single moment. It fades like evening light. Slowly, softly, until you realize you're standing in darkness. Natalie started visiting our house more often, at my father's invitation. He said he wanted to understand the kind of woman who had captured my heart. I thought it was progress, that maybe, for once, he wanted to support my choices. I was naive. He'd ask her about her life, her struggles, her dreams, and she'd answer with honesty. I loved that about her, how she never tried to impress him. She was genuine, even in front of someone who measured people by the price of their shoes. But over time, I began to feel something strange. My father's questions became more personal, more admiring. He'd compliment her cooking, her manners, her voice. He'd tell her stories from his youth, something he'd never done, even with me. Once, I walked into his office and found them laughing over coffee. His hand brushed hers when he handed her a cup. It was quick, almost accidental, but it felt wrong. My heart twisted, but I said nothing. Maybe I didn't want to see the truth. Later that night, I asked her gently, "You and my father seem to be getting close." She smiled, a little nervously. "He's just trying to be nice, Anthony. I think he's trying to accept me." Her words made sense. They always did. But something deep inside me, something my mother had planted years ago, began to whisper that this wasn't kindness. It was interest, and interest, in the hands of a man like Mr. David, was dangerous. My mother noticed it too. She had that quiet instinct. Mothers carry. She could sense when love was turning into something else. One evening, she called me into her room, her voice trembling slightly. "Anthony," she said softly, "your father isn't a man who gives without a reason. Watch him, please." I promised her I would. But promises don't mean much when you're blind to what's already happening. Weeks passed. I was buried in my art project for university, often gone for hours. Whenever I came home, I'd find traces of Natalie, a scarf on the couch, her perfume in the hallway, her laughter fading from the kitchen. Father began using her name too often. Natalie said this. Natalie thinks that... And my mother, she started spending more time in her room. She looked smaller, quieter, as if the house itself was draining her spirit. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. The sky was heavy with snow, and the streets were empty. As I walked through the front door, I heard voices coming from the living room, low, intimate. My father's and Natalie's. I froze behind the wall. "You deserve better than my son," my father said, his tone smooth, confident. "He's a dreamer. I can give you the life you deserve, Natalie. Comfort, stability." There was silence, the kind that stretches long enough to break your heart. Then her voice, soft but shaking. "Mr. David? Please, this isn't right, isn't it? You've seen how I care for you. I can make you happy. Think about it." I stepped back, my body numb. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I didn't want to hear more. I left before they could see me, the snow swallowing my footsteps as I walked into the night. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, until morning, trying to convince myself that maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe it was just a moment of weakness from him, not her. But in the days that followed, I noticed her distance. She stopped calling me as often. Her messages grew shorter. Her eyes, when she looked at me, carried something like guilt. My mother watched me silently. She didn't ask questions. She just sat beside me one evening and said, "Sometimes, Anthony, love doesn't leave. It changes shape, and not every shape fits our heart." A month later, Natalie came to see me. Her eyes were red, and her hands trembled. "Anthony," she said, "I need time to think. Things are complicated." I remember staring at her, trying to find the girl who once drew me under cafe lights. But she was fading, like color from a photograph. "Did my father say something?" I asked. She hesitated. Her lips parted, but no words came. Then she just said, "I'm sorry," and she left. For a long time after that, I didn't hear from her. My father, on the other hand, looked different, calmer, almost satisfied. He'd start humming while reading the newspaper, something he hadn't done in years. My mother stopped coming down for breakfast altogether. Then, one evening, as I was preparing dinner for my mother upstairs, I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, Natalie stood there, dressed beautifully, holding a small bag. Her eyes met mine. There was no love in them, only guilt. "I came to return this," she said, handing me the silver bracelet I'd given her on our anniversary. My heart sank. "You're ending it," she nodded slowly. "It's better this way." Behind her, I saw my father's car waiting by the curb. The driver was his. I felt something crack inside me, not loudly, not violently, but deeply. "Tell me it's not what I think," I whispered. She looked down. "I'm sorry, Anthony," and that was it. She left with my father that night. Afterward, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat on the floor of my room, staring at the empty bracelet box, until morning turned to noon. My mother knocked once, then came in quietly. She saw everything without needing to ask. She didn't tell me it would be okay. She just held my hand and whispered, "Now you understand who he is." Days turned into months. The news spread quietly. Mr. David and Natalie were together. He announced their engagement through a company dinner, dressed it as a new chapter of love and partnership. People whispered, of course. They called it scandalous, inappropriate, shameful. But wealth has a way of silencing morality. My mother didn't attend the dinner. She stayed home, her face pale but composed. When I told her I was leaving the house for good, she just nodded. "Go find peace," she said. "Don't let his sins live through you." I packed my things that night. As I walked out, my father stopped me in the hall. "Don't be childish, Anthony," he said coldly. "Natalie made her choice. You should move on." I looked at him, really looked at him, a man so powerful, yet so empty. "You didn't win her, Father," I said quietly. "You just bought her silence." He laughed, dismissive. "You'll understand one day, but I already did. I left Sweden for a while after that. I traveled to small towns, painting, writing, finding pieces of myself I'd lost in that house of marble and pride. My mother and I wrote letters, though she grew weaker each time. She passed away a year later, quietly, in her sleep. I didn't go back for the funeral. I couldn't face him. For years, I lived away from that world. I built a simple life, away from wealth and noise. Sometimes I'd walk by the river and think of Natalie, not with hate, but with the sadness of something unfinished. Then, one morning, many years later, the envelope came. White, simple, elegant, my father's handwriting. "Anthony, Natalie is getting married. She would be honored if you could walk her down the aisle." "Father," I stared at the letter, half laughing, half frozen. After everything, he wanted me to be part of their story again, as a silent witness, as if nothing had happened. But this time, I wasn't the boy who'd lost his love. I was the man who had learned the quiet power of distance. And so, I said yes. Not out of kindness, but because sometimes silence walks louder than anger ever could. I arrived in Stockholm 3 days before the wedding. The city hadn't changed much. Same gray skies, same whisper of cold that bit through the coat no matter how tightly I pulled it. But the streets felt different now. Maybe because I wasn't the same boy who once walked them, clutching a broken heart and unanswered questions. I stayed at a small inn near the outskirts of the city, far from my father's mansion. I didn't want to return there too soon. The thought of stepping into that place again, of smelling the same cologne, hearing his voice, seeing her, felt heavier than I could admit. But I had said yes, and when you say yes to ghosts, you must be ready to meet them. The first person I saw was her. Natalie arrived at the church for a rehearsal that afternoon. I stood at the back, quietly watching as she gave instructions to the wedding planner. She looked graceful, composed, more refined than I remembered, but something in her eyes was gone. That spark, that warmth that once drew me to her was missing. When she finally noticed me, she froze for a moment. Our eyes met, and for the first time in years, I saw guilt flicker across her face. She walked over slowly, clutching her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Anthony," she whispered, almost breathless. "You came? You asked?" I said softly. I couldn't refuse. There was a pause, one that carried too many unspoken things. "How have you been?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Alive," I said. "You?" She gave a faint smile, trying. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her earring. I noticed the diamond ring on her finger, huge, expensive, lifeless. It sparkled under the church light, but it didn't shine like the small silver bracelet she'd once worn. "You look well," she said quietly. "You too," I replied, though we both knew it was a lie. The silence between us was thick. The church organ hummed faintly in the background, as if the walls themselves were listening. Finally, she said, "My father-in-law wanted you here. He said it would be symbolic." Father-in-law. The words almost made me laugh bitterly, softly, like someone remembering a cruel joke. "Of course," I said. "Symbolic. That's what he's good at, turning pain into performance." Her eyes glistened, but she looked away. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I tilted my head. Then why is it she didn't answer? She just whispered. I didn't have a choice. I didn't press her. There was no need. The truth had already written itself between the lines of her silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her words. I didn't have a choice. I'd once believed she left me for wealth, for power, for comfort. But what if it wasn't that simple? What if my father had done what he always did, manipulated, controlled, bought her pain, and turned it into loyalty? The next morning, I went to the mansion. It looked exactly the same. Towering gates, manicured lawns, and that same air of arrogance that clung to the place like perfume. The butler recognized me instantly. His eyes widened, but he said nothing, just bowed slightly and led me inside. My father was in his office, of course. The room smelled of old books and cigars, and when he looked up from his desk, that same cold smirk curved his lips. "Anthony," he said, standing, "you look mature. The world's been kind to you, I see." "It's been honest," I replied. He chuckled, still poetic. "I suppose some things never change." I didn't smile. "Why am I really here, Father? What's this wedding got to do with me?" He leaned back in his chair, fingers interlocked. "It's about closure. You, me, Natalie, we've all moved on. This wedding represents peace. I thought it would be fitting if you walked her down the aisle as a gesture of forgiveness." I stared at him for a long moment. "Forgiveness? Yes," he said calmly. "It's time to put the past behind us. You can't cling to old wounds forever." I almost laughed, but it wasn't humor that rose inside me. It was something darker, quieter. "And does Mother get forgiveness too?" I asked. For the first time, his face shifted slightly. "Your mother chose to live in bitterness. You don't have to." My voice came out colder than I intended. "No, Father," she chose silence. "You just mistook it for weakness." The air thickened between us. He didn't respond, just looked at me with that same detached expression he'd worn all my life. As I turned to leave, I noticed a photograph on his desk, him and Natalie, smiling under the cherry trees. The image was beautiful, but something about it felt hollow, like a portrait of people pretending to belong in their own story. That evening, I walked through the old garden behind the house, the one my mother used to care for. The roses had been replaced by new, imported flowers. Everything she had planted was gone. I knelt down, brushing away frost from the soil, and whispered, "I'm here, Mom. I'll make this right, quietly, like you would have wanted." The wedding day came quickly. The church was grand, filled with guests in black suits and glittering dresses. Cameras flashed, soft piano played in the background. I stood by the entrance waiting for Natalie. When she appeared, the crowd gasped. She was stunning, but not in a way that felt alive. She looked like a painting, flawless, emotionless, framed by perfection. As I offered her my arm, she looked at me and whispered, "I didn't know he invited you until the letter was sent." "It doesn't matter," I said softly. "Let's finish what they started." We walked slowly down the aisle together. Every step felt like a conversation between past and present. Every light that hit her white dress reminded me of the snow that fell the night she left me. At the altar, my father stood proudly, older now, but still commanding the room with his presence. His smile was the same polished, confident, hollow. When we reached him, I stopped. Natalie's hand trembled against my arm. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for something I couldn't quite name. Maybe forgiveness, maybe courage. I leaned closer and whispered, "You don't have to marry him if you don't want to." Her eyes widened slightly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "It's too late," she whispered. I shook my head just a little. It's never too late to stop pretending. Then I turned to my father. Our eyes locked, his sharp and challenging, mine calm and steady. "Here she is," I said quietly. "The woman you taught me everything about how love becomes currency, how trust becomes leverage." "Congratulations, Father. You've finally bought what you couldn't earn." Gasps rippled through the guests. My father's jaw tightened, but he couldn't lash out. Not here, not in front of everyone. I placed Natalie's hand into his, then stepped back. But before I walked away, I added softly, "I hope the price was worth the silence you created." Then I turned and walked out of the church, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the marble halls. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Cold, silent, perfect. I didn't look back. Later that night, I sat by the river, the same place where Natalie and I once dreamed of a small cafe and a quiet life. I didn't feel anger anymore, just peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop trying to fix what others broke. But the story didn't end there. 3 months later, I received a call from one of my father's business associates. His voice was low, hesitant. "Anthony, I thought you should know. Your father's company, it's collapsing. Investments, gone. Partners leaving. And Natalie, she's filed for separation." I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. Life has its own way of balancing debts. I thanked the man, hung up, and looked out the window. Snow was falling again, just like the day it all began. For the first time in years, I smiled. Not out of revenge, but out of quiet understanding. My father had always believed he could control love with wealth. But love doesn't stay where pride lives. It slips away softly, beautifully, like snow melting in sunlight. After that winter, I didn't hear from either of them for months. The silence felt like snow, thick, muffled, almost peaceful. For the first time in years, I woke up without the weight of their shadows pressing on my chest. I moved to a small coastal town in southern Sweden, a quiet place where the sea met pine forests and fog rolled in every morning like a shy visitor. I rented a cabin near the shore and spent my days painting, writing, and walking along the cliffs. I thought I had left everything behind: the mansion, the betrayal, the pain. But memories have a way of finding you even when you hide well. Sometimes I'd see a couple walking by the water, laughing, holding hands, and I'd think of Natalie. Not with bitterness, but with the kind of sadness that feels like an old song you once loved but can't listen to anymore. Other times, when I watched the horizon fade into mist, I'd remember my mother, her soft voice, her calm strength. I realized then that everything good in me, the part that still believed in quiet dignity, came from her. About 6 months after the wedding, a letter arrived. No sender's name, just my address, in a trembling handwriting I instantly recognized. It was from Natalie. The envelope was slightly crumpled, as if she had held it too long before letting it go. Inside was a single page, folded neatly. "Anthony, I don't know how to begin this. Maybe I shouldn't, but I've lived with so much silence, and it's killing me. I wanted to tell you that you were right about everything. Your father didn't love me. He loved control. I thought I could handle it, that maybe he'd change, but people like him don't change, do they? They just move their cages from one heart to another. When he lost his business, he lost his mask. I saw who he really was: cruel, frightened, hollow. He treated me like an investment that failed. I'm leaving him. Not for you, for me. But I needed to say, I never stopped thinking about the way you looked at me the night I walked away. I saw pain, but I also saw grace. I didn't deserve that. If you can, please forgive me. If you can't, I understand. Either way, I wish you peace. Natalie, I read it several times, sitting by the window as rain tapped softly against the glass. My hands shook, not from anger, but from a deep, strange relief. Forgiveness, it's such a small word for something so heavy. For years, I had carried the bitterness like armor. It had protected me from feeling weak, from remembering how deeply I once cared. But reading her letter, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply done, and that, I think, is the truest form of revenge. To live without the pain they gave you. I never wrote back to her. Not because I hated her, but because some stories don't need to be reopened. She had her closure. I had mine. A few weeks later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Natalie had moved to the countryside, far from the city, and started a small cafe, the dream she once told me about. She named it Haven. The irony didn't hurt. In fact, it made me smile. Maybe she had finally found the peace she was always looking for. As for my father, Mr. David, his empire crumbled faster than anyone expected. Investors withdrew. Lawsuits followed. He sold his mansion, his cars, everything he once used to define himself. Pride, it seems, has an expiration date. He moved to a smaller house near the edge of the city. Alone, no Natalie. No wife, no friends left to impress. For a long time, I thought I'd never see him again. But fate, as always, has its own plans. One evening, nearly 2 years later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. A nurse spoke on the other end. "Mr. Anthony," she said gently, "your father's in the hospital. He's very weak. He's asking for you." I don't know why I went, maybe because part of me still wanted to understand the man who shaped my pain. When I entered the hospital room, the sight of him almost startled me. He looked smaller, frail, almost fragile, his skin pale, his hair completely gray. The once commanding man now lay surrounded by quiet machines, their steady beeping counting the time he no longer owned. His eyes opened slowly. When he saw me, something like shame flickered across them. "Anthony?" he whispered. I nodded, stepping closer. "I'm here?" For a long time, he said nothing, just stared at the ceiling, as if looking for words that never came easily to him. Finally, his voice cracked. I was wrong. That was it. 3 words. The first honest ones I'd ever heard from him. I didn't ask which part he meant about my mother, Natalie, or me. Maybe it was all of it. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. I sat beside him quietly. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic forgiveness. Just silence, the same silence my mother once carried, only now it felt softer, almost kind. After a while, he turned his head slightly, his eyes wet. "You look like your mother," he said. She was stronger than I ever understood. I smiled faintly. She still is. He closed his eyes, as if that truth brought him peace. A week later, he passed away in his sleep. At the funeral, there were few people, just business acquaintances and distant relatives. Natalie wasn't there. Maybe she didn't know, or maybe she chose not to come. I didn't blame her. I stood by his grave, the wind cold against my face, and whispered, "Rest, Father. Maybe this world will teach us both what love really means wherever we go next." Then I left, quietly. In the weeks that followed, I started writing again. Not about revenge or betrayal, but about love, loss, and the quiet strength of those who survive both. My words felt lighter this time, truer. I wrote about my mother's hands, about Natalie's laughter, about the frost on windows that once framed my heartbreak. And slowly, I realized everything I'd lost had given me something back. Pain had taught me patience. Betrayal had taught me boundaries. Silence had taught me peace. I began exhibiting my paintings in small galleries. People often said they could feel sadness in my art, but also healing. And I suppose that's what life really is, a mixture of both. One afternoon, while setting up a new collection, I received a small envelope with no name. Inside was a single photo of a cafe named Haven. In the window sat a woman holding a cup of coffee, smiling softly at the camera. Behind her, on the counter, was one of my old sketches, the one of her I'd drawn years ago. No note, no words, just that picture. I looked at it for a long time. Then I placed it in my drawer, not as a memory I wanted to keep, but as proof that life, somehow, always circles back to peace. And in that moment, I finally understood my mother's words, the ones that used to sound like riddles when I was young. Silence isn't weakness. It's dignity, wearing a softer face. It's been 5 years since all of that. 5 long, quiet years, filled with slow mornings, sea wind, and the kind of peace that only comes after losing everything you once thought defined you.